I've never liked my aunt's house. Even as a child, it gave me the creeps. The old Victorian-style mansion was filled with all sorts of antique knickknacks, but the worst was the marionette. It hung in the living room, its strings tied to a metal cross, with a gaunt face painted in grotesque detail. I hated it, but my aunt loved it, saying it was a family heirloom passed down for generations. One summer, when I was 13, I had to stay at my aunt's house while my parents were out of town. I dreaded it, especially since I had to sleep in the guest room adjacent to the living room. The first night I was restless, unable to shake the feeling that the marionette was watching me through the wall. I told myself it was just a toy, an inanimate object, but sleep didn't come easy. The next day, my aunt left early for work, leaving me alone in the house. I tried to avoid the living room, but curiosity got the better of me. I approached the marionette, examining its features. The exaggerated smile, the hollow eyes, the stiff limbs. It looked as if it were frozen in the middle of a sinister performance. As I turned to leave, I heard a faint creaking sound behind me. I spun around, heart pounding, but the marionette was still hanging there, motionless. I shook my head, feeling foolish, and walked away. But as I reached the door, I heard it again, this time louder. It was unmistakable. The marionette's limbs were moving. I froze, watching in horror as the marionette's head slowly turned to face me. Its painted lips curled into a smile, and its arms twitched as if trying to reach out. My breath caught in my throat, and I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the rug. The marionette's eyes seemed to lock onto mine, and I felt an icy chill run down my spine. The room suddenly felt colder, the shadows darker. I couldn't tear my gaze away from the puppet's lifeless eyes, now seemingly filled with malevolent intent. I bolted out of the living room, slamming the door behind me, and ran upstairs to my room. I locked the door and sat on the bed, trying to calm down, telling myself it was just my imagination. But the feeling of dread lingered, gnawing at me. That night I could barely sleep. Every creak, every rustle made me jump. At some point, exhaustion took over, and I drifted off, only to be awakened by a soft, eerie tune. It was a lullaby, played on some ancient instrument, its notes hauntingly familiar yet distorted. I sat up, heart racing, and listened. The sound was coming from the living room. Trembling, I crept to my door and cracked it open. The lullaby was clearer now, a chilling melody that seemed to pull me toward it. Against my better judgment, I followed the sound. As I reached the top of the stairs, I saw a faint light coming from the living room. The tune grew louder, more intense, and I could hear the rhythmic creaking of the marionette's strings. I descended the stairs slowly, my feet like lead. When I reached the living room, I found the marionette in the center of the room, its limbs moving in a grotesque dance. The metal cross it hung from was swaying on its own, the strings taut as if an invisible puppeteer was controlling it. I stood there, paralyzed with fear as the marionette's dance grew wilder, its head snapping back and forth in unnatural movements. The lullaby reached a fever pitch, and the room seemed to spin around me. The marionette's eyes glowed with an eerie light, and I felt a pressure in my chest, as if something was squeezing the life out of me. Suddenly, the music stopped, and the marionette collapsed to the floor, limp and lifeless once more. I gasped for breath, my legs trembling. I couldn't stay in that house another minute. I ran back to my room, grabbed my things, and called my parents, begging them to take me home. I never told anyone what happened that night. When my aunt passed away a few years later, the house was sold, and the marionette disappeared. But I still hear that lullaby sometimes in the dead of night when I'm alone. And every time I feel those cold, lifeless eyes watching me from the shadows.
The dollhouse was a gift from my grandmother, passed down through generations of our family. It was a stunning replica of a Victorian mansion, complete with intricate furniture, tiny chandeliers, and porcelain dolls dressed in period clothing. As a child, I was enchanted by it, spending hours playing with the tiny figures, arranging them in various scenes. But as I grew older, the dollhouse took on a more ominous presence. I was 14 when I began to notice strange things happening. It started with the dolls. I would leave them in one room, only to find them in another the next day. At first, I thought my younger sister was playing a prank, but she swore she hadn't touched them. One night, I woke up to the sound of faint whispering. I sat up in bed, straining to hear, and realised it was coming from the direction of the dollhouse. My heart pounded as I crept over to it, peering into the tiny rooms. The dolls were where I had left them, but the whispering continued, soft and insistent. I reached out to open the front panel, and the whispering stopped. The sudden silence was even more unsettling. I backed away, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The next day, I decided to leave the dollhouse alone, hoping whatever was happening would stop. But that night, the whispering returned, louder this time, and accompanied by the sound of tiny footsteps. I lay in bed, frozen with fear as the noises grew closer. Suddenly, I heard a soft knock on my bedroom door. I nearly jumped out of my skin. I sat there, paralysed, staring at the door, but it didn't open. The knocking stopped, and all was quiet again, except for the faint, almost imperceptible sound of giggling coming from the dollhouse. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the dollhouse and shoved it into my closet, slamming the door shut. But even then, I could hear the dolls inside moving around, whispering to each other. Over the next few days, things got worse. I started seeing shadows darting across my room at night, and objects would move on their own. My parents didn't believe me when I told them, thinking I was just having nightmares, but I knew it was the dollhouse. One evening, while I was alone in the house, I heard the whispering again. It was coming from the closet. I opened the door and saw the dollhouse, its front panel ajar, the tiny rooms bathed in an eerie glow. The dolls were all gathered in the parlour, facing the front as if waiting for something. Or someone. Then, without warning, the dolls began to move. Slowly, methodically, they turned their heads to face me. Their painted eyes, once dull and lifeless, now seemed to gleam with a malevolent intelligence. The air grew cold, and I could feel a presence in the room with me, something ancient and angry. I wanted to run, but my feet were rooted to the spot. The dolls began to speak, their voices a chorus of eerie whispers, telling me things I didn't want to hear. Secrets about the house, about my family, about myself. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the dollhouse, ran outside, and threw it into the garbage bin. I didn't care if it was a family heirloom. I just wanted it gone. That night, I slept with the lights on, but the whispering didn't stop. It followed me, echoing in my mind, tormenting me. The next morning, I woke up to find the dollhouse back in my room, perfectly intact, as if I had never thrown it away. The dolls were in different positions, their faces twisted into expressions of anger and malice. I screamed, finally breaking down. My parents rushed in, and when they saw the dollhouse, their faces went pale. They didn't ask me any questions, just took it and locked it away in the attic. But even then, I knew it wasn't over. Years later, I moved out and tried to forget about the dollhouse, but the memories still haunt me. Every now and then, I hear the whispering, faint but unmistakable, and I know the dolls are still out there, waiting for me.
Teddy bears are supposed to be comforting, a child's first friend and protector. But my teddy bear, the one I had cherished since I was a baby, became something far more sinister as I grew older. It started with small things, easily dismissed, a button eye that seemed to glint in the dark, a paw that was slightly out of place when I returned to my room. By the time I was a teenager, I had outgrown Teddy, leaving him to gather dust on a shelf in my closet. But he never left my mind. I would catch glimpses of him from the corner of my eye, always watching, always waiting. It was irrational, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was angry with me, that I had betrayed him by abandoning him. One night I woke to the sound of rustling. I groggily reached for my phone, illuminating the room with its dim light. That's when I saw it. Teddy was no longer on the shelf. He was on the floor, sitting up straight, his button eyes reflecting the light back at me. I rubbed my eyes, convinced I was dreaming. But when I looked again, he was closer. My heart pounded as I sat up in bed, not taking my eyes off the bear. Slowly I reached for the light switch, flooding the room with light. Teddy remained where he was, unmoved, but the air around him felt charged, like the calm before a storm. I couldn't sleep after that. Every creak, every shadow in the room set me on edge. The next day I decided to get rid of Teddy. I couldn't explain why, but the thought of him staying in the house filled me with dread. I threw him in the trash, feeling a pang of guilt, but also relief. That night, I slept soundly for the first time in weeks. But my peace didn't last. The following morning, I found Teddy sitting on my bed, his button eyes fixed on me with a malevolent intensity. My blood ran cold as I realized there was no way he could have gotten back into the house. I threw him out again, this time taking him to the dumpster at the end of the street. But the next day, he was back, sitting in the same spot on my bed, his fur slightly dirtier but otherwise unchanged. It was as if he was taunting me, daring me to try and get rid of him again. I tried everything, burning him, burying him, even cutting him into pieces. But no matter what I did, Teddy always came back, whole and unscathed. And with each return, he seemed angrier, more determined. Then, the dreams started. Night after night, I dreamt of Teddy chasing me through dark corridors, his button eyes glowing with a sinister light. No matter how fast I ran, he always caught up, his tiny paws grasping at my ankles, pulling me down. I began to lose sleep, my fear of Teddy consuming me. I could feel his presence, even when I wasn't in the room. A cold, oppressive force that weighed on my chest. I stopped going home, crashing at friends' places just to escape him. But it didn't help. Teddy found me, no matter where I went. One night I returned home, exhausted and defeated. Teddy was there, waiting on my bed, as always. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed him, intending to throw him out one last time. But the moment I touched him, a sharp pain shot through my hand. I looked down to see a deep scratch on my palm, blood oozing from the wound. I dropped Teddy and backed away, horrified. His button eyes seemed to gleam with satisfaction as I stared at the wound. It was then that I realized Teddy didn't just want to be rid of me. He wanted revenge. I fled the house, leaving everything behind. I couldn't stay there, not with him. I moved in with a friend, trying to rebuild my life, but Teddy never left me. I see him in my nightmares, feel his presence in every shadow. He's waiting, biding his time, and I know that one day he'll find me again.
As a child, I was fascinated by mechanical toys. My favorite was a Clockwork Soldier my grandfather had given me. It was a small, intricately detailed figure, dressed in a red uniform with a tiny musket over its shoulder. When wound up, it would march in a straight line, its arms moving in time with its legs. I adored that toy, playing with it for hours on end. But as I grew older, I left it behind, moving on to more modern distractions. The soldier was packed away, forgotten in a box in the attic. Years later, when I was in my 20s, I moved back into my childhood home after my parents passed away. It was a bittersweet experience, sorting through their belongings and rediscovering the toys and trinkets of my youth. That's when I found the Clockwork Soldier again, tucked away in a dusty box. I wound it up, just to see if it still worked. To my surprise, it did. The soldier marched across the floor, just as it had when I was a child. But something about it felt different, off. The movements were smoother, more deliberate, as if the toy had learned something in the years it had been in storage. I shrugged it off and placed the soldier on my desk, a nostalgic reminder of simpler times. But that night, as I lay in bed, I heard a faint ticking noise. I turned on the light and saw the soldier standing on the floor by my bed, its clockwork mechanism still turning. I was certain I had left it on the desk. I picked it up, wound it down, and placed it back where it belonged. But the next morning, it was on the floor again, this time at the foot of the bed. The ticking was louder now, almost insistent. Over the next few days, the soldier's behavior grew more erratic. It would move on its own, appearing in different rooms, always marching toward me. The ticking followed me everywhere, a constant reminder of its presence. I tried to ignore it, but the soldier wouldn't let me. One night I woke to find it standing on my chest, its tiny musket pointed directly at my face. The ticking was deafening, filling the room with its relentless rhythm. I swatted it away in a panic, but the soldier landed on its feet unharmed. I watched in horror as it wound itself up, the key turning on its own. The soldier began to march again, its eyes fixed on mine, the musket aimed with unnerving precision. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The toy was alive, and it was angry. I grabbed the soldier and hurled it across the room, but it didn't stop. It kept marching, even as it hit the wall and fell to the floor. I ran to the attic and threw it into the box where I had found it, slamming the lid shut. But the ticking never stopped. I could hear it through the floorboards, a relentless beat that echoed in my mind, driving me to the brink of madness. No matter how far I tried to distance myself from the toy, it followed me, its presence a constant, oppressive force. Eventually, I left the house, abandoning everything in it, but the ticking still haunts me. I hear it in the dead of night, growing louder with each passing day. The Clockwork Soldier is out there, marching ever closer, its mechanical heart beating with a malevolent life of its own. And I know, deep down, that it will find me, no matter where I go.
My grandmother had always been a collector of dolls, porcelain dolls to be exact. Her house was filled with them, lining the shelves of every room. As a child, I found them fascinating, if a bit eerie. But there was one doll that always gave me the chills. It was an old, worn thing with a cracked face and faded blue eyes. My grandmother called it Emily, and she claimed it was her favorite. When my grandmother passed away, the doll collection was passed down to me. I wasn't particularly thrilled about it, but I couldn't bring myself to throw them away. So I stored most of them in the attic, except for Emily. I placed her on a shelf in the living room, partly out of respect, and partly because I was too afraid to put her away. It didn't take long for strange things to start happening. I would come home to find Emily in different positions, sometimes standing, sometimes sitting. Once I found her lying on the floor, her cracked face turned toward the door as if she had been waiting for me. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, or maybe the house settling, but the incidents became more frequent and more unsettling. One night, I heard a faint rustling sound coming from the living room. I crept downstairs, heart pounding, and found Emily sitting on the couch, her faded blue eyes staring directly at me. I quickly turned on the light, but nothing seemed out of place. I chalked it up to exhaustion and went back to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. I kept hearing noises, soft thuds and rustling, as if someone, or something, was moving around in the dark. The next morning, I found Emily sitting at the kitchen table, her cracked face turned toward the window. The sight of her made my blood run cold. I was certain I had left her on the shelf the night before. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was watching me, waiting for something. I decided to get rid of Emily. I couldn't bear the thought of her staying in the house any longer. I wrapped her in a blanket and drove to the nearest donation center, leaving her there without a second thought. But that night, I was awakened by a loud crash. I bolted upright, my heart racing. The sound had come from the living room. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously made my way downstairs, dread pooling in my stomach. When I reached the living room, I froze. Emily was back, sitting on the shelf where she had always been. The blanket I had wrapped her in was lying in a heap on the floor, and the shelf was covered in dust, as if she had never left. My hands trembled as I reached for her, but before I could touch her, the flashlight flickered and went out. I was plunged into darkness, and in that moment, I felt a cold, bony hand wrap around my wrist. I screamed and yanked my hand back, scrambling for the light switch. When the lights came on, Emily was back on the shelf, her face twisted into a malevolent grin. The air around me felt thick and suffocating, and I knew I wasn't alone in the room. I ran upstairs, locking myself in my bedroom, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't sleep that night, too terrified to close my eyes. The next morning, I found scratches on my wrist, as if someone had tried to claw at me. I knew I had to get rid of Emily for good. I took her to the backyard and dug a deep hole, burying her as far down as I could. I covered the hole and placed a heavy stone over it, hoping that would be the end of it. But that night, I heard the rustling again, followed by the sound of footsteps. I bolted upright in bed, my heart in my throat. Slowly, the footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped just outside my bedroom door. The doorknob rattled, and then the door creaked open. I stared in horror as Emily, covered in dirt and grime, stood in the doorway, her cracked face twisted into a look of pure hatred. I never should have brought her into my home. I never should have tried to get rid of her. Now she's back, and she won't stop until she's had her revenge.